why reporters were injured, why regular people who I would hope all of us would want to stand up to hate groups, why they were injured by our police. What we know from video coverage is the police don't always tell the truth. There's no video showing counter-protesters attacking police. In fact, ultimately, the reason given was that they had to get back to their cars and they had blocked themselves in. In 2017, before the Max stabbings, the gentleman responsible for that marched down 82nd Avenue with a police escort, a Portland Police Bureau escort. They were also escorted out of my community so that they could safely leave. When you look at the pictures of what is taking place in this community, the police have been a tool in the past, certainly from my childhood, of brutalizing people standing up for their civil rights. As I see this rise of white nationalists in this city, for the first time in my life, I am fearful when a pickup truck with an American flag rolls up near me. I look for the nearest exit. What is my exit strategy? We are a city known for protests. We even survived the George Bush years. We are known for making space for people to protest what they want to protest. It is our right as Americans. It is our obligation to stand up against hate. Because if the brave children and men and women had not stood up in the 60s, when people that look like me were just trying to register to vote, trying to get decent housing, trying to get decent education, if we had not stood up, just because that was the law at the time, it was not a just law. I want to encourage you to slow down this ordinance, and let's have some community meetings in January when I join you, so that we can talk to the community about how we keep everybody safe. It's important for you to understand that we don't all experience the police the same way. When white women protest, the police come out with cameras and pussy hats and smiles. When African Americans and other people of color and people with less power protest, they come out in full riot gear. We cannot have a police force for white people and then a police force for everybody else.
Yes.
I would hope that we would take all the testimony today and slow this way, way, way down. I want you to know I trust Chief Outlaw. I believe that she has built a good team, but she is absolutely mistaken to think that we should give the police chief power to decide who protests, when, where, and how. And so thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to working with you to make sure all of us can feel safe when encountering Portland police officers. Because that's not today, but I hope it is in the real near future. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Commissioner Fish.
Thank you very much, Mayor. First, I want to just acknowledge that prior to this hearing, a number of organizations reached out to my office, and I had a chance to either speak with them directly or through my senior staff. Georgetown Law Center, Brennan Institute, Urban League, Oregon Justice Resource Center, Western State Center, CARE Oregon, ACLU, to name some. And so I don't want to repeat those conversations. They've been helpful. I do want to ask Kimberly McCulloch a number of questions. And if the mayor would give me 2 or 3 minutes.
Absolutely.
And if it is, Kimberly, if it's your preference to follow up in writing with any of these questions, I urge you to do so.
It's so dark in
We've
here.
got a little time
Add
not voting
lighting.
today. And so I want to make sure I
What's
can
demonic
get the
energy?
benefit
What's she
of
have?
reviews. Now, I was not involved in the either the research or the preparation of this ordinance. So when I hear my friends in the ACLU say that you're scrambling to do an analysis, take a look at both the federal questions and the state law questions, you're not alone. And all of us would like to get that right. We'd like to make sure we're looking at the right law and we're following the right guidelines. And obviously, one of the questions that could come before the council is, can this ordinance be strengthened? We'll hear from others that there's no way that this can be strengthened. It just needs to be withdrawn. But there's a range of views we've heard. So in the spirit of making sure I understand your views, and I have not had the benefit of reading your testimony in detail, which I will again after the hearing, here's a few questions I wanted to ask you. The case that the city attorney's office has relied most heavily on is called Minotti versus City of Seattle. And you can Google it and download it, and it's long, but I really encourage people to read it, because whether you agree with the case or not, and whether you agree with the ordinance or not, it's the roadmap that the city attorney's office used to craft this ordinance. So we have the benefit of standards set forth by a court. And I just want to make clear, do you and the ACLU believe Minotti is still good law?
There is a question about whether or not Minotti is still good law based on more recent precedent, but I think that's sort of less important than the fact that the facts that gave rise to that case were just absolutely and completely different than this circumstance. So if I could just describe that really quickly. There, the underlying ordinance was an emergency ordinance that authorized the declaration of emergency. We actually have that same ordinance here already in the city of Portland. And that what happened was there was a declaration of emergency that imposed a curfew on the city of Seattle. I was actually there when that happened and lived right next to the curfew zone, and was actually forced out of downtown. So anyhow, it was imposed in response to actions that were actually taking place. My colleague actually just explained what ended up happening with that, but I think it's important to note that the city of Seattle ended up paying millions of dollars in settlements because of that action.
Yeah.
In addition, I think it's also important to note that it was really not anything any of us would call good policing. They used tear gas on tens of thousands of peaceful protesters because a few people smashed some windows. In addition, when I heard that this was based on a Seattle ordinance, I actually reached out to our colleagues in Seattle and said, what the heck is this? And they were baffled, frankly. And then they came back to me and they said, well, it's interesting that this is being raised because recently the city of Seattle tried to impose some insurance rules on protesters based on past violence and a prediction that they would engage in violence. And the ACLU of Washington contacted them and explained why a number of different cases, including particularly Forsyth is sort of the ruling case there, that it is unconstitutional for them to do that. And the city of Seattle has actually suspended those rules and is considering rescinding them entirely. So they're actually moving
Those rules about
opposite.
requiring insurance.
Can you go get me
Based
a
on
piece of
past violence and
paper to
predictions
put
of
over
violence,
like?
that's correct.
So I would welcome,
Just 1 second, could I just interrupt 1 second? Could you please turn the lights off on the back, because I can't look at the speakers with the light shining right in my eyes, I get migraines.
She's getting me a light.
You're certainly welcome
It's just
to
the
film.
dark demonic energy in here and the lack of lighting.
all right. I had the same feeling, Commissioner Fisher. Thank you.
So did I.
Well, if in your supplemental materials,
True, too. It's been an art of mine for a while as well, so having a hard time staring at that light definitely.
She's taking care of it.
thank you. And if in your follow-up materials, there were additional cases you want us to look at, welcome that. One of the themes of this hearing and materials that I've received are sort of a debate about whether the existing tools that are at the disposal of the police commissioner and the police chief are adequate, and whether there are additional tools that are constitutional that could help us meet what I think is a shared goal, which is to minimize violence and make the opportunity for peaceful protest as robust as possible. Does your testimony outline any additional tools that you're encouraging us to consider?
Yes, it does. In particular, we've heard this idea that if there are credible threats of violence, that somehow law enforcement is supposed to just sort of stand back and not do anything. If there are actual credible threats of violence, we think that law enforcement should follow up and should investigate and should try to prevent folks who are actually creating a clear intent that they're going to engage in violence to do so. We definitely encourage separating groups that are engaged in conflict at a protest, and we've actually seen Portland police do that well in some instances. And in fact, the example that was brought up of the protesters being across the street from each other, aside from the fact that law enforcement was facing all one direction, which sent a very odd message, we actually thought that that protest was going well at that point. Of course, then the kettling happened after that, which was problematic, but that's aside from that point. We do also think that, when people commit acts of violence, that there are ways to hold them accountable, and those accountability mechanisms actually can prevent future violence. For example, in civil context, restraining orders can restrict a person's movement. If a person is convicted of an assault crime or some other violent crime, they can be subjected to probation conditions. We obviously have concerns about overcriminalization of our communities, but when people actually engage in acts of violence, I think we expect there to be some response. In addition, we are a little bit confused about why there are some pretty well-documented instances where people have engaged in violence in our city that have not been appropriately dealt with. A little bit perplexed about that. And I think this all raises another question, and I think my colleagues actually raised this as well, which is that there has been many instances throughout the history of our city of the safety of our communities actually being endangered by police response to protests. And so if we're serious about addressing the safety of our communities, we need to talk about things like the use of crowd control weapons, what sort of de-escalation techniques we're using, and what kind of training law enforcement have to actually respond to protests in a peaceful manner.
Let me hold you there for a second.
Yeah.
I'll read your testimony
Yeah.
and I'll follow up. Mayor, if I could just have a couple more questions. This is enormously helpful for me. We did a little survey, and some of the groups we met with helped us on this, and we looked at places like New York, Denver, St. Paul, and others that had versions of a tool that the mayor is seeking. Some look very suspiciously very similar to the tool here. Have you had a chance to canvass other cities and to determine whether in the implementation of those ordinances or rules that are at least first cousins of what the mayor is proposing, whether they have been determined to raise constitutional issues?
So the closest
So they
things that
put
I've seen
security
are,
next to
things
cop
that are actually
watchers.
similar to laws that we already have on the books around permitting and regulations that can be imposed on permits. I have yet to see an ordinance that looks like this. If someone can give me an example of one of those, I would love to be able to reach out to our affiliate in whatever other location and get their analysis. But I have seen a list of supposedly similar ordinances, and they're quite distinct in my legal opinion.
So let me follow up. What you just said about permitting is very important because as it turns out, and New York City's been in the news recently, they actually take a hard line if you don't get a permit. And they will take arrests of groups that don't get a permit. And historically, Portland has not done that. We have avoided taking mass arrests of people that don't get a permit. And there are a number of groups in the last couple of years that have said, really as a statement of principle, they're not going to get a permit. So we have to make a decision. Does the ACLU have a view about whether our current hands-off practice about allowing people to protest without a permit needs provisions?
I'd like to pass on giving you a firm answer on that, and I think that's something that I would like to discuss with other folks and get back to you. But I will say that I did reach out to sort of our national listserv of affiliates and asked folks, are there other jurisdictions that are doing this well? Because I would love to be able to point the city to some good examples. And folks at our New York affiliate actually wrote me back this morning and said there are good and bad things happening here, and that they'd be happy to talk. So I think that we can engage in some of these conversations about what's working other places. I would love to be able to give you, to point you to a place that's doing this well.
Last question, and I appreciate your patience and thoughtfulness. Let's say under one scenario here, based on all the testimony we get and the input, the mayor proposes some additional changes to narrow the scope of this ordinance and to address constitutional concerns. But it's still, you still have concerns, National Lawyer Guild still has concerns, other groups still have concerns. What that could set up is a fight. Either once an order is issued and the city attorney said that a written order, someone could go to court and seek an injunction, or probably more likely when someone's arrested and the arrest is challenged under the order. This will get to federal court very quickly. We'll go to state court, then go to federal court, and in federal court, there'll be a debate about the constitutionality. So a federal judge will look at it, and a federal judge may say, I like this,